Hello, I'm Sarah Halter, Executive Director of the Indiana Medical History Museum. Thank you all for joining us today as we close out Women's History Month with the First Ladies of Psychiatry in Indiana. This is presented by Angela Bowen Potter. Angela is a PhD candidate and Rosslyn Research Scholar at Purdue University, focusing on the history of medicine and digital humanities. She earned a BA degree from Purdue University and MA degrees from the University of Georgia and from IUPUI here in Indianapolis. Her research approach comes from 3 decades of work in the field of public history. Her talk today is part of her larger research on mental illness treatment in Indianapolis, and her research has been published in co-authored books, IU School of Medicine, A History, and Women at Indiana University, 150 Years of Experiences and Contributions. So welcome, Angie. We're delighted to have you back with us today.
I'm excited to present on one of my favorite subjects. Sarah, is that my shared screen up?
Yes, I see it.
Hey.
Love the color too.
Yeah, well, it's a sad day in our house today because of Purdue's loss. Got a lot of Purdue fans in our house, so it's an ode to Purdue. There we go. I am going to be talking a little bit more informally today, but just kind of to give you an overview. The early women in psychiatry, the Indiana Medical History Museum has done a number of great presentations on this area, including on Sarah Stockton and on Mary Angela Spink. And these women who at times worked at Central State and also at Nurenberger and other locations set the stage for the women that I'm going to talk about today. In addition, women were significant as patients, and this combination of women as patients and also women as practitioners became really critical as part of the feminist movement comes to psychiatry. I'll talk about that more at the end. So one of the most enigmatic and women in psychiatry in Indianapolis is Margaret Morgan. She was the first commissioner of mental health in Indiana, the first commissioner of mental health in the United States who was a woman. And yet she's virtually unknown in the history of psychiatry and women in psychiatry, which is unfortunate because she was really a pioneer in the field, and it shows some of the difficulties of being a woman who's trying to practice medicine in public. And that's one thing, a theme that runs through her life. And she's the most fascinating woman. I really wish that I could meet her, and if anybody has more memories of her or anything to add to her story, I would love to hear more. So she's a Hoosier. She was born in Indiana, went to Indiana University. As she started her training, really interested in theater and drama, and then changed to look more into science. While she was young, she married Garrett Brown, which is first of several memories. She went on to University of Louisville to finish her undergraduate degree. Then she went on to become a doctor of medicine, received that degree in Maryland. Now, her relationship history during this period was stormy, and she bounced around to several different colleges during the period. In addition, her personal life was stormy as well. Her first marriage really was, according to her family, somewhat of a mismatch. He was a prominent businessman, and her interest in medicine put her a little bit at odds. Now, when she was at the University of Maryland, she met her second husband, Harry Kupfer. He's a I have Harriet, but he was a fascinating individual. After they broke up, he went to California and was part of the very active California psychoanalytic community. He was a psychoanalyst to the stars, and was Elizabeth Taylor and many other leading ladies were on his couch, so to speak. He was a prominent speaker and gave numerous TV interviews and had articles featured prominently in magazines such as Time, but also such as Playboy. She went on to do her graduate training in New York, which put her at really the center of innovation and excitement in this period of psychoanalysis and neuropsychiatry. She was at Grasslands Hospital and then Vahalia in New York. She also did her internship in neurotraining at Bellevue Hospital in New York, which is sort of a famous hospital up until this day, and particularly in the area of psychiatry. In 1944, during the war, she went to did her residency stay at the New York Psychiatric Institute, which is a quite prominent, well-respected psychiatric institute, particularly at that time in psychoanalysis. Here she would meet many people that would be part of her career moving forward. She decided to also practice in private practice on Madison Avenue, but she continued her love of teaching at the postgraduate medical school in New York. It's important to stop for a minute and think about what it meant to be trained as a neurosurgeon and also as a psychoanalyst. These are two different ideas about the way the mind and the body work. They're different in terms of the kind of skills and training needed. And they're really areas that, as in historiography, we see in contrast to each other, as opposed to ways that they were overlapping. And I think looking at these women, as I've seen, looking at their residency training and the people that they worked with was one aspect of the way this debate between the mind experience and the body and neurology, the way that these interactions with other colleagues helped to shape the movement going forward. One of the people she would have met at this time and would be influential throughout her career is Daniel Blaine. Blaine was, after the war, tapped to help launch the VA's neuropsychiatric program in the VA hospitals. And Blaine worked really hard to build up partnerships with the universities, which was critical in reshaping the way the VA hospitals worked. Then he went on to become director of the medical director of the American Psychiatric Association. And here he was influential in trying to build partnerships with the state hospital systems and the academic psychiatry and then private practice psychiatry. And this was really difficult for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about in a little while. But it would be amazing to have been on her couch in the post-war era and just to see what psychoanalysis looked like at that time. While we associate the couch with psychiatry, we actually don't have a lot of images of what it looked like in psychiatric offices during the time. There's really just like a dozen or so images. So it would be really exciting to see what her practice looked like at that time. And, you know, the people that she would have interacted with there were the who's who of psychiatry at the time. Morgan was not able to complete her psychoanalytic training in New York. So she would go on to work on that when she was back in Indiana. She had a high-profile marriage to Jewel Menard. And here is a news clipping in the New York papers about their high-profile divorce. The initial line of the report says, a lady psychiatrist, tall, brunette, and attractive, was charged in Supreme Court yesterday with being an unfit mother because she flushed off to Switzerland on a skiing vacation without concern for her son, 1 year and 9 months old. In the end, she actually won and was able to bring her son back to Indiana. And she returned to her home state and went to the IU School of Medicine, and she was teaching and consulting at the VA, as well as in establishing her own private practice. The marriage broke apart, officially ending in 1951, but she, in many ways, the relationship was really broken in 1950, and that was just the final step. We don't know too much about her time at the School of Medicine. She was listed as the consultant at the VA hospital, and that was when it was just opening in 1953, as well as teaching initial classes and interviewing. So we don't know a lot about this time period. In 1953, she was selected to become Indiana's first commissioner of mental health, and it would be difficult to underestimate how it was just unbelievably sensational that she was chosen for this position. There was numerous articles in the paper trying to introduce her to the public. She was selected by George Craig, and he was governor, and he was very charismatic, a prominent Republican. He had served as the American Legion national president, which helped to launch his political career here in Indiana. He was seen as a maverick and a reformer. So his decision to pick Morgan certainly was a break from the establishment, whether it was within the IU School of Medicine, or within the state hospital system. He said he was going to, in a very gendered way, hand the broom to her to clean up the state mental hospitals. And she was quite amazing in the ambition that she showed in her attempts to begin reform. In the past, reform at Central State and at the state hospitals more broadly was just increasing the amount of funding to help improve conditions, expanding the facilities and staff shakeups, not mix-ups, but shifting positions for various superintendents and other reforms. But this was a different kind of reform program because it was focused on treatment as opposed to just the facilities and caring. So Morgan was attempting to approach her superintendent from the perspective that she took from private practice, as opposed to a perspective from being in the state hospital system. Now, as we first think about that, it may not seem like that large of a distinction, but in reality, it was a lot there. It was quite different. When the superintendents had basically focused on the hospitals from this caring perspective, and there was not, so the administration of the hospitals really took into account a lot of custodial roles. When you look at the annual reports from that period, it breaks down the number of food that was served, the kinds of diet was served, down to like the bushels of different apples and oysters and things that they were fed. So it's really interesting to look at the detail in this portrait of the care, but the lack of focus on treatment. So Morgan, one of her first acts was to create treatment plans for all of the inmates or patients, depending on your perspective from the state hospital system. Now, medical treatment plans are something that we're all familiar with, to the point that we don't think about necessarily how radical and how large of a task that would have been. So there was approximately 13,000 patients within the hospital system at that point. And so that would require doing treatment plans for all those individuals. She deputized physicians at the IU School of Medicine to help in the creation of these reports. In addition, there was the need for x-rays and other supporting blood tests and other supporting documents to help flesh out the treatment plans. And when alternate conditions were discovered, treating them, which would have helped release. And so the misdiagnoses of patients that had been at different state hospitals for a long time made news and helped to reestablish the importance of treatment plans. In just an interesting note, at Larue Carter Hospital was where the commissioner was where the office was. And so they had this pool of typists that were busily trying to type out the treatment reports. And at one point, a critic at the state legislature said that there were two patients and one secretary at Carter Hospital. And that seems ridiculous that they needed that many secretaries. But when you think about creating all of these treatment plans at once, it was a truly monumental effort. In addition, there was a large number of media visits. So there was movement around to try and make sure the wards would look like they needed. And here is a media shot from a Central State ward that was pictured in this Here Is Look magazine from 1955. In addition, there were training videos and research videos that were published. So people that worked at the time talked about the efforts to prepare for these different media visits. And it wasn't just creating plans, though. Craig and Morgan made an effort to recruit new psychiatrists, psychologists, but also physical therapists, occupational therapists from all over the nation. Morgan would go to different professional organizations, and she stood out as a woman. And so she was able to really recruit some important talent to come to Indiana when at a time when it was quite difficult to find people. Now, you don't have to be a historian to guess what happened, she began to build controversy in Indiana. Each of these changes was interrupting decades of pork barrel spending, if you will, or targeted spending, political machine appointments, and just big business that the mental health system had. It was approximately 10% of the Indiana state budget at the time. So unlike some of her predecessors, Morgan decided to court not only public perception here in Indiana, but also nationally. In 1955, she organized two high-profile visits to the Indiana state hospitals, and these were covered in the Saturday Evening Post, Look magazine, which I have here on the screen, Police Digest, and even Vogue magazine. And scientists, even the most distinguished scientists, have never had a spread in Vogue magazine. So this was really quite a difference of trying to highlight her as a physician, looking at her as a politician, looking at her as a woman. And so these different understandings of interpretations of her are part of this ambiguous legacy. In the article pictured here, she was described as having gray eyes that must have blinked when she scanned the archaic mental health setup with its 10 institutions running as semi-autonomous little kingdoms. They reflected her carefully cultivated image as a executive physician, psychiatrist mother that was equally comfortable in a domestic role in the same state house mental hospital ward. So this is the second page of the Look article. I put the whole thing in here because I love the half-naked man with his towel. But you can see Morgan here in her role as a mother, and she's playing with her son Morgan there. So Morgan was forced out of office at the end of 1955 as George Craig was defeated. And so she went on to join Daniel Blaine in becoming Deputy Commissioner of Mental Health in California. And after that, she returned to Indiana and had a private practice in Indianapolis. She did not play any leading roles after that, or public roles that we might expect either here in Indiana, such as being president of a professional organization, or nationally. In fact, in history, in articles about the importance of women in psychiatry, historically, she's never mentioned. And so this is a really critical gap in the literature that needs to be explored in more detail. So the next person I wanted to talk to you about is Clare Assue. And in nearly every oral history that I've done, her name came up as an amazing mentor and teacher and clinician. And where Morgan was really controversial, Ashu was really was thought of quite highly within the psychiatric community here in Indianapolis. She was born in 1922 in New York City, and she graduated from Hunter College in New York City, and then she received her doctorate degree at Howard in 1954. At this point in time, it was really difficult for African Americans to find residency placements, and her own experience underscores that. First, she was at Beth El Hospital in Brooklyn, and Jewish hospitals were one of the small number of hospitals that allowed African American residents. And then she went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, where she did a portion of her residency. She also did a portion of her residency here in Indiana. She married a Indiana physician, Frank Brown, and then and so that I think was important in her decision to return to Indiana for her practice. St. Elizabeth Hospital, featured here in Washington, D.C., was the federal government's first hospital, mental hospital, first and only up until relatively recently. She here there was many cutting edge research programs. It was also here that Goffman's famous article about or book on asylums, where the phrase institutionalization was popularized. That's where the research was done here. I love this image of Ashu as a young woman facing her career, and the wind we were blowing definitely signified the difficulties of a woman, African-American woman, in psychiatry at this point. Psychiatrists were really influential in helping to foster some of the racial difficulties and racism. So a woman taking a stand in this culture would have been quite difficult. She came to Carter Hospital in 1958. So this was just after Morgan stepped down from her position. One interesting fact that I find really fascinating is that she was chief of the men's service for a number of years here. And if we think about back to Stockton, in the early period of Indiana, the women doctors were often seen as most appropriate to treat women patients, but also were kind of sidelined, having to deal with women's concerns and women's hysteria. So the fact that Ashu was in the men's service breaks this long tradition of seeing women psychiatrists to be forced into the role of relegated to the role of treating women. And she really was interested in the efficacy of mental health research, and the most cost-effective and long-term results of treatment. And that was somewhat different than a lot of the trends in psychiatric research of the time. Larue Carter went through a number of studies trying to trace the impacts of psychiatric treatment over time, and those were important in trying to make the next steps in terms of community mental health and breaking down the role of state hospitals as the only treatment option in mental illness. She was very dedicated to teaching. She was a mentor to numerous students and psychiatric residents. It was important to her and the department that undergraduate medical education psychiatry played a predominant role because it was the primary way of recruiting new psychiatrists into the discipline. So the psychiatry department had quite significant presence of psychiatry in the curriculum, and the majority, if not all of the students, would have had time at Larue Carter Hospital, as well as the various clinics. And that allowed the school to really be able to recruit a large number of residents into the field. And it was quite difficult at that time, the competition. So she did play a role nationally in the field of teaching and public service. She took over as the, she took over the position as director of Larue Carter Hospital in 1982. And this promotion made her the first African American to run a state hospital in the United States, male or female. And what's notable is that her experience also is not included in standard accounts of women in psychiatry. The 1980s was a quite difficult time in the medical profession and hospitals, and particularly in mental hospitals. So her ability to steer the course through this rocky period where many state hospitals were closing was truly remarkable. Her colleagues universally praised her for her clinical skill, her teaching, and her administration. And now, last but not least, I want to talk about Nansky Roski. And one important point was that Ashu and Roeske wrote an influential psychiatric textbook together. Nansky was the co-author and Ashu was a secondary author. And so this shows a relationship between these various women at the time. So they were all in some ways overlapping, presenting them sort of in chronological order of their coming to Indiana. But this textbook is notable for a number of reasons. First of all, a woman being a lead author on a textbook in the 1970s was quite unusual in of itself. And then having the majority of women authors was noticeable, but in addition, it used innovative new techniques in teaching, including taped cassettes of different kinds of clinical interview, video cassettes, and they had a large video lab at Larue Carter, and were really interested in ways that they could use this kind of technology in not in teaching psychiatry, and to a lesser extent in patient treatment. So and this use of this textbook here at IU and across the country to a lesser degree helped to establish not only psychiatry as an area of disease, but into these the ways that psychiatry helped with creating interviews and relationships between patients and their physicians. So Roeske was born in Minnesota, and while she wasn't born here in Indiana, it shows a strong trend of Midwesterners who were most attracted to the IU and tended to stay here longest. She was in a family of surgeons, and her family had a long history of women being educated. She went to Vassar, a noted women's college, and this is quite different from the other psychiatrists that I'm talking about here today. That women's education piece is different. She went to receive her doctorate in medicine at Cornell. She began doing her training in 1955, but then paused to take care of her children before going back to complete her residency and then taking over as director of the Riley Child Guidance Clinic. Roeske was gained some of her most influence at the national level. She was in part of this large child guidance child psychiatry program here at IU, which was one of the nation's leading child psychiatry program. It was quite small at the time, and it still is an area where there's a tremendous need for more child psychiatrists. She served in an educational role, and that is something that's common with women in psychiatry, is their interest in education. The challenge of this being those kinds of positions that of service and education are less likely to result in publications and takes away from service in areas, clinical areas. So it's one of the ways that women have this strong influence in the programs, but how their contributions are sometimes undervalued in the history books or within the profession or at the university. So the invisibility of women's labor in this area is significant. She was also active in other charities and other institutions around Indianapolis. Typically, we think of psychiatry and the state hospitals, but there was a number of other state institutions that had connections with psychiatry, psychology, child guidance, and disability. And so she was active in working with the School for the Blind and in other areas of child handicap development, as she talked about at the time. I really love this image of the Raleigh Child Guidance Center, because it's one of the images that of a type that we've all experienced sitting at in a board meeting. And I love the coffee, and there's milk and a pipe on the table, and the blackboard. I think what I love about this image is the men looking to her, and even though she's sitting there, she's still commanding the room, and we can get a real sense of her commitment, her pride in her field. So Roeske was chairperson of the American Psychiatric Association Task Force on Women from 1973 and 1975. And this was a critical juncture in psychiatry and in the feminist movement. And there's been quite a bit of research done on the connections between feminism and psychiatry part, and predominantly the women have been associated with the anti-psychiatry movement for critiquing the conception of women as fundamentally sick, empty, Freudian penis envy. And so feminist psychiatrists were speaking back. Roeske took a slightly different approach than some of the feminists at the period. She focused on humanism, and she focused on women's overlapping roles as mothers and as wives and in families and in the community, not pointing to a single part that defined them and attempting to bridge these gaps that were seen and the negative infighting, and try to bring a common voice based on humanism. And to that degree, her voice has been silenced in the historiography on two recent books on the anti-psychiatry movement that focus on this task force, her voice has not been included and has really been sort of left out of the story that is focusing on the anti-psychiatry movement as the predominant critique of psychiatry at the time, and not looking at the humanism. And it's exciting because her career was marked by this edited volume in her as a memorial, and in it it was edited by IU School of Psychiatry chair Hugh Henry, and inside there's a number of different types of studies looking at the idea of humanity in approaches interpersonal and education and treatment, and even in economics. And I think the volume really speaks to the ways that humanity and influence all areas of practice, not just in the role of psychiatrists or in the role of treating and looking at women. So I think it's a real inspiration. In addition, it is important with the medical humanities program that approach that would start to build at the time. And IUPUI has an exciting role in this medical humanities movement, and I think shows this real clear thread throughout the time period. So it's difficult to talk about how the story of these different women hold together. It would be exciting to say that Morgan's role as the first commissioner led to these other strong women being here in Indiana. But I think as far as my research shows, that argument does not necessarily stand up very well. There isn't a lot of documentation that Morgan was particularly encouraging of women in psychiatry. As just one note, and I've always found it fascinating, when they designed the Institute of Psychiatric Research, which was Morgan's special interest in her work with them, they didn't include the same number of female bathrooms as male bathrooms. And so once the building opened, they had to quickly reconfigure things so that there were an adequate number of female bathrooms, because there was a number of female researchers at both Larue Carter and at the Institute. So I think that shows that just this inclusion of women or having women's voices in the room did not necessarily show this continuity. One thing that I think does is John Nurenberger, who was the first director of the Institute and a longtime chairman of the department. He helped to support women in their careers and was responsible in bringing numerous women and men and women husband and wife collaborations, or perhaps wives and husband collaborations, to Carter Hospital and the Institute. And I think that is a through line that we see in the other careers here. Just the culture being supportive of women and families. There was numerous women at both sites, so that was there for those informal supports. There's also more direct relationships. We see that some of the families shared babysitters or shared different kind of sitters and different things. So that's real continuity. But it's notable that Roeske took time off when her children were little from her studies and her career. So it shows the differences that are there in that portrait. And like I mentioned, the importance of education was a theme going across. Finally, it is the question of why don't we know about these women and the difficulties of being of the difficulties of stories that are left out from the dominant narrative in psychiatry. The conclusions that we read in many of the books are only talking about the largest universities, but my own research shows that Indiana was important in terms of the research that was being done, of training that was being done, and really was well connected within these national networks, which then asks the question, then why isn't our voice being always heard? Indiana's focus on biopsychiatry and really limitation of psychoanalysis here places Indiana outside of the mainstream, not alone, but outside of the stories we typically hear. In addition, our strength in child psychiatry is notable and an area which hasn't been well researched within the historiographical record. Roeske has a scholarship named in her honor at the American Psychiatric Association for excellence in teaching. And so, although her name has been left out of the history books, it continues to be spoken within the American Psychiatric Association and continues to her work in the researchers that are doing this outstanding teaching around the country. I've kind of skipped through a lot, so I'll be excited to answer any questions.
Robin asks, can we get a brief summary of the woman who specialized in autism?
Yes, Marianne DeMyer was an outstanding researcher in autism. She began her work looking at autism from behavioral perspective, and then she was opened an important research center on early childhood schizophrenia, which now we refer to as autism. And so what was really innovative about her research was that she really approached it as a research problem, and she approached it from the perspective of not psychoanalytic perspective, but looking at a number of different themes. So she did research on, she looked at diet and sleep, at brain waves, at language acquisition, and she worked with a wide variety of different collaborators. Those included speech pathologists and people in audiology and different specialties. And so that was really critical because it gave a chance for collaboration across different universities, and also gave a lot of people training, whether it was any of these fields, to be able to gain experience with people with autism and in different kinds of is it sharing my screen now?
It is.
Okay. So here's a picture of Marianne DeMyer. She was like in the same post-war cohort of the other researchers that I've spoke about. And so here is a picture of the locations of child psychiatry. So we have Larue, Carter, and the Riley clinics. So her research began in behavioral analysis. And this is an early textbook from that period, and the Institute for Psychiatric Research that I mentioned. And we're really probably most familiar with her colleague, Charles Furster, who was a student of Skinner's, and here's an example of a Skinner box. So their first experiments in what's called behavioral pharmacology were in 1961, and this is a really early example of that thread. And so the machine you see here is one of the most interesting things I've seen. It is a training machine for pigeons, because the classic training of pigeons was done one at a time. So this allowed for the training of multiple pigeons at the same time. And so at the bottom of the image, you can see the little pigeon's head sticking out. And then the top images, like the head isn't sticking out. And so they were able to rotate it and train it. The kind of unfortunate thing was that they trained the pigeons to stick their head out of the box, and then they couldn't train them to put their head back in the box. So the early models tended to chop the pigeon's head off, and you can see sort of how that's happening there on the bottom. But it was the idea that to bring together neurochemical research and behavioral research, since there was well-established data on pigeons response times, they could use that to look at new neurochemicals in the research of serotonin and other neurotransmitters. So the initial behavioral research with children with autism was using some of this same idea of behavioral research, but applying it to humans and applying it to another research context. So this is an example of the room that was used to look at behavioral in autism. And there was various different reward systems, because there wasn't a really good understanding of what would be considered a reward for children with autism, because they were not nonverbal and the research hadn't been done. So some things that were included were a pinball machine, a phonograph, a treats, just classic food and trinkets, a train set. So there was a variety of different ways. And I found it really interesting to look at what learning looks like from this point of view. And so when, with having a child with autism and, living with it, I sometimes feel like our own house is like a research lab. So you can kind of see how, number one, how small the sample sizes are. There's a relatively small number of children, and just how behavior looks so different when we think about it from that perspective than what we think about it in our own life. So here's a couple images at Larue Carter and the different therapies that were available. And then she was writing against the predominant theory of refrigerator mothers that was produced by Bettelheim and others. And she advocated for a tripart diagnostic system for autism that brings together behavioral, intellectual, and cognitive aspects of autism. And that's really sort of what that really responds to what we understand about autism today, but was not popular at the time, where these single model, single cause ideas about origins of disease really caught headlines and caught prevailing winds within the field, but doesn't necessarily correspond with the research. Now, if we think about the debates about autism being relatively recent, but this here is a table from 1972 looking at the behavioral characteristics of early childhood psychosis. So there was an attempt to bring together all these different research models, research findings, and put them together and look what were the commonalities and what were the differences. So our own kind of debates about what autism is and what it means are not new, and they go back to the origins of the disorder. What I find particularly amazing about her research was that she worked with families and really included parents into the research. She also published a book that was aimed at families going through families with autism, trying to help them translate the most recent research to their own lives. And I think that kind of translational scholarship is something that is far too rare because it, isn't as well rewarded within the academic medical system. And just one other thing that I found amazing was that she advocated what she called a semesters idea in the treatment of autism, where individuals would spend some intensive time in the hospital working on training and learning new skills, and then they would spend another semester or hunk of time in families, so that there was able to gain skills and then strengthen them in the home environment and then gain more skills. And having worked with the children constantly in the research wards, they had a real understanding of the cost of autism in the family and the difficulty of providing this kind of training in a family environment. And I think this is, to me, really being a mother, really is really critical, because she really thought about not just an individual patient, but within the family context. And I also think it's exciting because my son and I were able to be in a research study that has been done more recently at IU that's looking at many of these same issues. So it's somewhat exciting that this thread of research continues, but it's discouraging because one of the lead authors on the project had no idea that this research had been done at IU. And so with the rise of ABA therapy, her kind of legacy has come back into the forefront, and the newest research is supporting some of these ideas.
Thank you. Thanks again, Angie, for a really great presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again in person. April 13th, we have our spring forensics lecture, and there'll be more information about that and a link to register on our website, so keep an eye out. Due to the limited seating, we still will require registration in advance, and we're also hoping to be able to stream it for a virtual audience as well. So keep an eye out for more information about that, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.